The morning sun cast long shadows across Wright's auto repair, where Sarah Wright was already elbow-deep in a transmission rebuild. Her weathered hands moved with surgical precision, each motion deliberate and focused, much like they had been during her time as a Marine Scout sniper. The locals in the small town of Cedar Grove, Montana, knew her as the big gal who could fix anything with an engine, but none of them knew about her previous life, about the medals locked away in her attic, or about the reason she chose this quiet corner of Montana to raise her daughter alone. The familiar squeak of the shop's screen door announced Emma's return from her morning run. At 16, Emma was everything Sarah wasn't at that age. Confident, outgoing, and determined to make the world better. While Sarah had found her calling in the silent watch of a sniper's nest, Emma found hers in organizing community events and standing up for kids who couldn't stand up for themselves. "Morning, Mom," Emma's voice echoed through the garage, followed by the thump of her backpack hitting the worn leather couch in the office. "Mrs. Henderson's chickens got loose again. Helped her round them up on my run." Sarah smiled, not looking. "Up from the transmission. That's the third time this month. Maybe we should offer to fix her fence instead of just collecting the escapees." Her voice was soft, but carried easily in the quiet morning air. Years of whispering commands in combat zones had taught her how to make every word count. "Already suggested it," Emma replied, grabbing her work coveralls from the hook. Unlike many teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else, Emma loved spending her summer mornings helping in the shop before heading to her lifeguard job at the community pool. "She's letting me organize a community fence-fixing day this Saturday. Have the school's volleyball team already volunteered?" Sarah finally looked up, wiping her hands on a shop rag. At 5'11" and 240 pounds, she didn't fit the typical image of a former Marine Scout sniper, and that had always worked to her advantage, both in the service and now. People tended to underestimate her, see only the friendly mechanic who stress-baked cookies for her daughter's volleyball team and volunteered at the local animal shelter. They didn't see the woman who could hit a target at 1,000 yards or who'd saved her entire unit in Kandahar with nothing but patience and perfect timing. "Just make sure everyone knows basic safety protocols this time," Sarah cautioned, remembering the chaos of Emma's last community project. "We don't need another incident like the Great Paint War at the youth center." Emma laughed, pulling her long brown hair into a ponytail. "That was one time, Mom, and admit it, the mural turned out amazing, even if we did have to repaint half the parking lot." The morning routine continued peacefully as they worked together on various projects. Sarah had taught Emma everything she knew about engines, just as she'd quietly taught her about situational awareness and self-defense, wrapping the lessons in games when Emma was younger. Now they moved around each other with practiced ease, a well-oiled machine in their own right. The rumble of approaching motorcycles broke their rhythm. Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment, her ears cataloguing the sound automatically. 5 bikes, maybe 6 custom pipes approaching from the east. Old habits died hard, and something about the aggressive rev of those engines set off warning bells in her mind. "Emma, honey, why don't you go check our inventory in the back?" Sarah's voice remained casual, but Emma caught the subtle shift in her mother's tone. 15 years of living with a veteran had taught her to read the signs. "Mom," Emma hesitated, halfway through an oil change. "Just for a few minutes, sweetheart." Sarah straightened up, seemingly absorbed in wiping her hands clean, but her eyes were already mapping angles and positions, just like she'd done thousands of times before. The motorcycles pulled into the shop's gravel parking lot, kicking up, dust clouds that drifted through the morning sun. 6 riders, all wearing leather cuts with a burning skull patch, the mark of the Hollow Men, a motorcycle club that had recently moved into the area. They'd been making waves in Cedar Grove, but until now they'd left Wright's auto repair alone. Sarah watched through the garage's open door as they dismounted, noting their positions, their stance, the subtle bulges under leather jackets that suggested concealed weapons. The leader, a tall man with a greying beard and scarred knuckles, swaggered toward the entrance. Sarah recognized him from town meetings. Dylan Deadeye Thompson, former president of the Hollow Men's chapter in Wyoming, rumored to have moved here after things got too hot there. "Morning," Sarah called out, pleasantly, her voice carrying the same friendly tone she used with all customers. "What can I help you folks with today?" Deadeye Thompson's boots scraped against the concrete floor as he entered the garage, his eyes scanning the tools, the half-finished projects, and the immaculate organization of the workspace. Behind him, his crew spread out in a practiced formation that might have seemed casual to untrained eyes, but Sarah noticed how they positioned themselves to control sightlines and potential exits. "Nice setup you got here," Deadeye drawled, running a finger along the polished tool chest. "Clean, professional. Bet you do good business in Cedar Grove, being the only shop for 20 miles. "We stay busy enough," Sarah replied, continuing to wipe her hands on the shop rag. Her movements were unhurried, but she had already noted potential. Weapons within reach, the heavy wrench on her workbench, the jack handle by the wall, the impact driver that could double as a projectile. "Did one of your bikes need work?" Deadeye smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not today, ma'am. We're here about community relations. See, Cedar Grove's changing, growing. Needs protection from less savory elements, if you catch my meaning. In the back room, Emma pressed herself against the wall near the door, listening. Through the small window, she could see Mrs. Henderson's old Buick pulling into the parking lot, probably coming to schedule that fence repair. The elderly woman stopped, short when she saw the motorcycles, then slowly backed her car out and drove away. "Cedar Grove's got a sheriff's department for protection," Sarah said, her voice still pleasant, but carrying an undertone that made two of the younger Hollow Men shift uncomfortably. "Plus a pretty active neighborhood watch program. Your concern is touching, though. Sheriff's department can't be everywhere," Deadeye countered, moving closer. "Accidents happen, equipment fails, shops burn. Smart business owners understand the value of supplemental security." Sarah set down her shop rag and turned to face Deadeye directly. Despite her size, she'd always had a way of moving that spoke of contained power rather than bulk. "How about we cut to the chase, Mr. Thompson? Name your price, and I'll explain why that's not going to happen." A tense silence filled the garage. One of Deadeye's crew, a muscular man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, took a step forward, but Deadeye held up a hand to stop him. He was studying Sarah with new interest, like a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. $2,000 a month, he said finally. "Reasonable, considering. Half what we charge in bigger towns." Sarah's laugh was genuine, but held no humor. "That's funny. You know what else is funny? How quiet this town was before you showed up. How peaceful. Like that youth center Emma helps run. Never needed security cameras before your boys started hanging around." Deadeye's expression hardened. "Careful, lady. Being the only mechanic in town's a privilege. Be a shame if something happened to change that. You know what else would be a shame?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "If people found out the Hollow Men couldn't handle a fat female mechanic, word gets around in the biker community, doesn't it? Might make you look weak." The snake-tattooed man moved again, this time reaching under his cut. Before he could complete the motion, Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing a heavy wrench and bringing it down hard on her solid steel workbench. The crack echoed like a gunshot in the enclosed space, making everyone jump. "Oops," Sarah said mildly. Hand slipped. "Speaking of accidents, you might want to tell your friend that if his hand comes out from under that jacket with what I think it's reaching for, we're all going to have a very educational day about human anatomy and pain thresholds." Deadeye's eyes narrowed, really seeing Sarah for the first time. There was something in her stance, in the way she controlled the space around her, that finally registered. "You served," he said. It wasn't a question, I did, Sarah confirmed. Just like you did, Mr. Thompson. Marines, right? I recognize the cover you're trying not to touch when you're thinking hard. Old habits die hard. This revelation caused a subtle shift in the garage's atmosphere. Deadeye's hand had indeed been drifting toward his cover, an unconscious tell he thought he'd trained himself out of years ago. The fact that she'd noticed, had been reading him this whole time, changed the dynamic. Let me give you some free advice, Sarah continued, her voice still conversational, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Cedar Grove doesn't need your kind of protection. These people, they look out for each other. They fix fences together, help round up stray chickens, paint youth centers. They don't need men like you coming in and breaking things just so you can charge to fix them. Emma, still listening from the back room, felt a surge of pride at her mother's words. This was the mom she knew, the one who taught her that strength wasn't about intimidation, but about standing firm for what's right. Deadeye. Thompson and his crew left Wright's auto repair without further incident that morning, but Sarah knew better than to think it was over. She'd seen that look in men's eyes before, wounded pride mixed with dawning curiosity. It was often more dangerous than straight-up hostility. Throughout the day, signs of trouble began surfacing across Cedar Grove. Jack Peterson's hardware store reported motorcycles circling the building all morning. The community pool where Emma worked called to say they were closing early due to unexpected maintenance issues, after two hollow men spent hours lounging by the entrance. Even Mrs. Henderson, who'd finally returned to the shop late afternoon, reported seeing bikers parked at the end of her road, just watching. They're mapping the town, Sarah explained to Sheriff Kate Martinez as they sat in the shop's office that evening. Learning patterns, marking territories, finding pressure. Points. Kate, a former Army MP who'd been Cedar Grove's sheriff for 6 years, nodded grimly. Like they did in Riverton before the place went to hell. Started with protection fees, ended with them practically running the town council. She paused, studying Sarah with knowing eyes. Deadeye's going to look into your background. Let him, Sarah replied, checking the security camera feeds she'd installed years ago out of old habits. My record's clean, honorable discharge, all the proper paperwork, nothing to find. Nothing in the public records, Kate agreed. But we both know Deadeye's got connections. He starts pulling threads. He might find out about Kandahar. Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. That op's still classified. Besides, everyone involved is either dead or... She trailed off, remembering the one loose end she'd never managed to tie up, or running outlaw motorcycle clubs. Kate finished. Deadeye Thompson wasn't always Deadeye. Back when he was Master Sergeant David Thompson, he had quite the reputation in military intelligence, specialized in identifying high-value targets. The implications hung heavy in the air. Before Sarah could respond, Emma burst into the office, her face flushed with anger. Mom, they're at the youth center. 3 of them. They're harassing the kids, telling them they need to pay for membership fees if they want to keep using the basketball court. Sarah and Kate exchanged looks. How many kids? Kate asked, already standing. About a dozen, mostly the younger ones who come from River Heights. Emma's voice cracked slightly. River Heights was Cedar Grove's lowest-income neighborhood, where many single-parent families lived. They knew exactly who to target, Mum. These kids can't even afford new shoes, let alone protection money. Sarah felt a familiar coldness settling in her chest, the same feeling she used to get when looking through her scope, watching targets threaten innocence. Kate, how long would it take to get your deputies to the youth center? 10 minutes minimum. Jones is handling a fender bender on the highway, and Rodriguez is clear across town dealing with a noise complaint that I'm betting was staged. They're isolating resources, Sarah noted. Standard tactics. Emma, honey, I need you to send out an SOS on that community app you helped develop. Emma was already pulling out her phone. The app had started as her coding club project, a way for Cedar Grove residents to coordinate community events and share alerts. Message sent. Mrs. Henderson already responded. She's calling everyone on her phone tree. Sarah moved to her. Office safe, quickly inputting the combination. Inside, past the shop's paperwork and cash box, lay a small case she hadn't opened in years. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before moving to grab something else, a small camera designed to look like a typical mechanic's inspection tool. "Kate, I need you to do something for me," Sarah said, handing over the camera. "Drive. By the youth center. Don't stop, don't engage. Just get me eyes on their positions. Sarah." Kate's voice held a warning. "Trust me. No violence. Just information." Sarah's voice carried the same quiet authority it had when calling shots for her unit. "Emma, pull up the youth center's blueprints. You still have them from the renovation project, right?" While Emma retrieved the blueprints from her laptop, Sarah made 2 quick phone calls. The first was to Mark Chen at the local paper, who also happened to be an amateur photographer with a very good telephoto lens. The second was to Annie Blackwood, who ran the coffee shop across from the youth center and had been a combat photographer in Iraq. "They're not just targeting the kids," Emma realized, spreading out the blueprints. "The youth center sits on the highest point in town. Clear lines of sight to the main street, the sheriff's office, and the highway." Sarah nodded, pride mixing with concern at her daughter's tactical awareness. "It's not about money. They're establishing a command post disguised as simple intimidation. Classic insurgency tactics. Start with the vulnerable, expand through strategic positions, then control the whole territory." Kate returned 15 minutes later, her expression grim. "They've got 2 more bikes hidden behind the building. Recognized one of the riders, Tommy Switchblade Carter. He's wanted in 3 states for assault." "Got pictures?" Sarah asked. "Better." Kate handed back the camera. "Got video of them taking money from 12-year-olds while standing under. Security cameras they didn't notice. Switchblade's parole officer would be very interested." "Save it," Sarah advised. "We might need leverage later. Right now, we need to focus on getting those kids out safely." The situation at the youth center resolved itself before Sarah needed to intervene, but not in a way anyone expected. Mrs. Henderson, all 78 years of her, had marched straight up to the Hollow Men with her church quilting circle in tow. The sight of 6 elderly ladies armed with nothing but disappointment and cell phones, recording everything, proved too much, even for hardened bikers. They'd retreated, trying to maintain their dignity while being lectured about bullying children. But Sarah knew it was just the beginning. That evening, as she and Emma closed up the shop, the true cost of defying the Hollow Men became clear. Calls started coming in from across town, customers cancelling appointments, making excuses about finding better rates elsewhere. Even loyal clients like Tom Baker, whose family had been bringing their cars to Wright's Auto Repair for years, called to apologetically explain that he needed to explore other options. "They're scared," Emma said quietly, watching her mother. "Note another cancellation in the appointment book, just like those kids at the youth center." Sarah nodded, her face thoughtful. "Fear's a powerful tool when you're trying to control people. Make them think standing together is more dangerous than giving in." She looked at her daughter, seeing not just the teenager before her, but the strong woman she was becoming. "That's why what you're doing at the youth center is so important. You're showing those kids they're not alone." The shop phone rang again. This time it was Annie from the coffee shop, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Sarah, you need to see this. They're at Max's garage in Millbrook." Sarah's hands clenched. Max Torres had been her mentor when she first moved to Cedar Grove, teaching her the local business landscape while she got her shop established. He'd recently retired, selling his garage to his daughter Carmen, who'd apprenticed under him for years. "What are they doing, Annie?" Making an example. "They offered Carmen the same deal they offered you. When she refused," Annie's voice cracked, "they're destroying everything, Sarah. Tools, equipment, customer files. Carmen's in the hospital." or tried to stop them and took a bad fall, or was pushed, depending on who you ask. Emma, who had been listening, gasped. She and Carmen's daughter Isabel were close friends, both part of the same coding club at school. "Mom, we have to do something." "We will, honey." Sarah's voice was calm, but Emma recognized the subtle shift in her mother's posture. The same change she'd noticed during the confrontation in their garage. "Annie, keep watching. Document everything. I'll handle it." After hanging up, Sarah made 2 more calls. The first was to Sheriff Martinez, though she knew the response would be too late to save Max's garage. The second was to a number she hadn't dialed in years. "Captain Reynolds, it's Wright. Remember that favor you owe me from Kandahar? I need information on a Master Sergeant David Thompson, now going by Deadeye." An hour later, Sarah sat in her office reviewing everything Reynolds had sent. The files painted a clear picture. Deadeye Thompson wasn't just some washed-up vet turned outlaw biker. He was building an empire, using military precision to expand his territory. Cedar Grove was just the latest target in a pattern that stretched across 3 states. Emma's voice interrupted her research. "Mom? Isabel just texted. She's at the hospital with her mom." Her voice trembled. "Carmen's got a broken arm and a concussion. Isabel says..." She says one of them laughed while doing it. Said it was a message for the fat mechanic who doesn't know her place. Sarah closed the files, slowly, methodically. She thought about Carmen, who'd arm-wrestled her at last year's town festival. About Max, who'd taught her which local suppliers could be trusted. About the kids at the youth center, counting their lunch money to pay protection fees. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Emma asked, seeing the change come over her mother's face. "No, honey, they're not. Not unless someone makes them." Sarah stood, moving to the gun safe hidden behind a false panel in her office wall. She didn't open it, just rested her hand on the cool metal. Deadeye's using fear because it's efficient. Break 1 person publicly and 10 more fall in line without a fight. Like Carmen, Sarah agreed. But he's forgetting something important about small towns like Cedar Grove. Here, everybody's connected. Carmen's not just a business owner, she's Isabel's mom, your friend's mom. She's Max's daughter, Annie's high school basketball teammate, Mrs. Henderson's goddaughter. When you hurt one person here, you hurt everyone, Emma finished. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What was that thing you used to tell me? About being a sniper? About..." Sarah smiled slightly, remembering the sanitized versions of her military stories she'd shared over the years. That the best shot is the one you never have to take. That sometimes, just knowing someone's watching is enough to change the game. The shop's security system chimed, warning of movement in the parking lot. On the monitor, they could see 3 hollow men circling the building on foot, taking pictures with their phones. "They're documenting entry points," Emma observed, her voice steady despite her concern. "Like you said, mapping territories." "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but they're about to learn something important about territories." She pulled out her phone, sending a group text to a list of numbers she'd prepared after the morning's confrontation. They're about to learn that Cedar Grove already belongs to someone, to everyone. The hollow men struck at midnight, but Cedar Grove was ready. Sarah had spent the evening coordinating with a network of volunteers through Emma's community app, positioning people in strategic locations throughout town. When the roar of motorcycles shattered the night's peace, Annie Blackwood's camera was already documenting everything from her apartment above the coffee shop. Deadeye led a column of 20 bikes straight toward Wright's auto repair, their headlights cutting through the darkness like angry eyes. They found the shop's parking lot empty except for Sarah, who stood calmly under the security lights, still wearing her work coveralls. "Didn't expect you to be stupid enough to face us alone," Deadeye called out as his crew surrounded the lot, their bikes forming a threatening circle. Sarah's laugh carried clearly in the night air. "Funny, I was thinking the same about you." She nodded toward the surrounding buildings. Nice guns, by the way. But you might want to tell Switchblade that brandishing a firearm while on parole is a serious offense, especially when there are so many cameras around. Deadeye's head snapped up, finally noticing the glint of camera lenses in various windows. Annie's telephoto lens from the coffee shop. Mark Chen's professional camera from the newspaper office. Dozens of cell phones held by community members who had quietly gathered to bear witness. Cameras don't stop bullets, Snake Tattoo snarled, revving his engine. No, Sarah agreed. But they do make excellent evidence, just like the surveillance footage from Max's garage. The same footage that's already been uploaded to multiple secure servers, along with documentation of every threat, every act of intimidation, every dollar extorted from children. She took a step forward, her size and presence suddenly filling the space in a way that made several bikers shift uneasily. But you want to know what's really interesting? The pattern of your operations across 3 states. The military precision of your tactics, the specific targeting of strategic locations. She locked eyes with Deadeye, almost like someone with intelligence training was running things, someone who used to identify high-value targets for a living. Deadeye's face hardened. "You've been digging. I had help. Captain Reynolds says hello, by the way. Remember him from that classified operation in Kandahar?" Sarah's voice carried just enough weight to make Deadeye's eyes widen slightly. The one where a certain master sergeant's career ended after some questionable decisions about civilian casualties. The tension in the parking lot shifted. Several of the Hollow Men were looking at their leader with new uncertainty. Deadeye's grip on his handlebars tightened until his knuckles went white. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "Don't I?" Sarah's voice was almost gentle. "I was there, David. Different unit, different role, but I saw what happened. I saw what kind of man you really are. The kind who'd sacrifice innocence for tactical advantage, the kind who'd terrorize kids to control a town." Deadeye's face went through a series of emotions before settling on cold rage. "Take her down," he ordered. 3 bikers dismounted, moving towards Sarah with predatory confidence. They hadn't taken 2 steps before precise shots rang out, picking off their bike tires with surgical accuracy. The sharp cracks echoed off the surrounding buildings, followed by the hiss of escaping air. "That came from the water tower," one of the Hollow Men shouted, turning to look. Another shot, another tire deflated. "No, the church steeple." A third shot, a third tire. "The grain silo." Sarah hadn't moved. Amazing what a small town can do when it comes together. "See, while you were busy mapping our streets, we were setting up our own little training program. Turns out lots of folks here have useful skills. Annie was a combat photographer. Mark was a tactical communications specialist. Even Mrs. Henderson. Did you know she was a competitive sport shooter back in the day?" More shots rang out, systematically disabling bikes without endangering riders. The Hollow Men scattered, trying to identify threat directions that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Stop!" Deadeye's voice cracked with authority. "You think this changes anything? You think some small-town mechanics and shopkeepers can stand against us?" "No," Sarah replied calmly. "I think a community standing together can stand against anyone. But since you mentioned mechanics..." She pulled out a small remote control. "You really should have paid more attention to your bikes while they were parked outside the youth center earlier. Carmen wasn't the only one who learned things from old Max." She pressed the button. Throughout the parking lot, bike engines began to sputter and die, the result of precisely calibrated mechanical sabotage that only a skilled mechanic would know how to execute. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone used to making impossible shots under pressure. "You're going to leave Cedar Grove. Not tonight. Your bikes need work that only a qualified mechanic can provide. Work that will take exactly as long as it takes. for state police to verify some interesting information about your operations in other counties. And during that time, you're going to learn something important about picking your battles. The morning after the confrontation, Cedar Grove buzzed with activity. Sarah's shop had become an impromptu community center with disabled motorcycles, lined up outside like wounded soldiers. Inside, Emma helped her mother document each bike's condition with photographs and detailed notes, while Sheriff Martinez supervised the process with barely concealed satisfaction. "You really did a number on these machines," Kate said, examining the precise nature of the sabotage, "enough to disable them without causing permanent damage, just like your old mission reports." Deadeye, who sat in a corner under deputy supervision, looked up sharply. Sarah paused in her inspection of a fuel line, feeling the weight of multiple gazes on her. "You might as well tell them," Kate continued. "They're going to find out anyway, and it might help some of them understand what they've stepped into." Sarah straightened up, wiping her hands on her ever-present shop rag. She looked at Deadeye and his crew, seeing not just outlaws, but lost soldiers who'd forgotten their way. Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Wright, Marine Scout Sniper, retired. 8 years, 4 deployments, 218 confirmed missions. "Bullshit," Snake Tattoo spat. "There weren't any female scout snipers." "Back then." "Officially, no," Kate agreed. "Unofficially, there was a classified program. Women who could blend in where male snipers couldn't. Who could get closer to targets because no one expected them to be a threat." She smiled slightly. "Hard to spot. A sniper, when you're looking for someone who fits a certain image." Deadeye's face had gone pale. "Kandahar," he whispered. "The market operation. That was you." Sarah nodded slowly. "The mission you compromised. The one where you were willing to sacrifice a school bus full of children to get to your target." Her voice carried no accusation, just stated facts. "You never knew who took the shot that stopped that tragedy. Never knew it came from the fat woman selling vegetables 3 stalls down." The garage fell silent as the implications sank in. Emma watched her mother with new understanding, pieces of her childhood falling into place. The games that taught situational awareness, the emphasis on patience and precision in everything from engine work to baking cookies. "I tracked you for 3 days in that market," Sarah continued. "Watched you ignore intelligence about civilian presence, dismiss concerns from your own team. When you gave the order to proceed despite the bus, I had a choice to make. Take the shot that would expose the program but save those kids, or maintain, uncover and live with the consequences. You chose the kids," Deadeye said quietly. "I chose the kids. Lost my position in the program, but gained something more important, the knowledge that I could live with myself." Sarah moved to her toolbox, pulling out a worn photograph. "The military classified everything about that day, but one of the mothers tracked me down years later, gave me this." She handed the photo to Deadeye. It showed a group of Afghan children at a school graduation ceremony, smiling at the camera. "Those are the kids from the bus. 5 years later. The one in the middle became a doctor. 2 more are teachers. All of them got to grow up because someone chose them over the mission." Deadeye stared at the photo for a long moment before passing it back with trembling hands. Some of his crew were watching with dawning respect, others with confusion, but all were affected by the weight of the revelation. "After that, I couldn't go back to regular operations," Sarah explained, returning to her inspection of the bikes. "Couldn't be the person who followed orders without questioning their cost. So I retired, found this town, opened this shop, thought I was done making hard choices about who lives and who dies." She faced Deadeye directly. "But then you brought war to my home, threatened my community, hurt people I care about, made me choose again between maintaining cover and protecting innocence." "We didn't know," one of the younger Hollow Men spoke up, "about you, about Kandahar." "No, you didn't. Just like those kids at the youth center didn't know why they were really being targeted. just like Carmen didn't know why she was really attacked. Sarah's voice hardened slightly. But now you do know. You know exactly who you're dealing with and what I'm capable of. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Emma, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. Mom's not the only one you should be worried about, she said, her voice clear and strong. Look around. Every person in this town has a story, has skills you didn't bother to learn about before you tried to take over. Mrs. Henderson was a champion shooter. Mr. Chen was Special Forces Communications. Annie was a combat photographer. Even I'm not just some kid. I wrote the app that helped coordinate last night's defense of our town. A town full of warriors, Deadeye murmured almost to himself, hiding in plain sight, just like you were in that market. Not hiding, Sarah corrected. Living, building something worth protecting. And we're giving you the same choice I had in Kandahar. You can be the threat that needs to be stopped, or you can be part of something better. Your bikes will be fixed in exactly 3 days. By then, you need to decide which path you're taking. 3 days passed like a held breath in Cedar Grove. Sarah's shop became the center of carefully controlled activity, with Hollow Men members watching in shifts as she methodically repaired their bikes. Some watched with hostility, others with growing curiosity, as her skilled hands brought their machines back to life. On the morning of the 3rd day, Deadeye arrived alone, earlier than usual. He found Sarah already at work, Emma helping her. Bleed the brake lines on one of the last bikes. You could have permanently disabled them, he said without preamble. Instead, you chose precise, reversible damage. Why? Sarah continued working as she answered. Same reason I used to take disabling shots when lethal ones were available. Sometimes people deserve a chance to make different choices. Deadeye pulled up a shop stool, watching them work in silence for a while. Your daughter's got good hands, he observed, steady, like a surgeon or a shooter. She's got her own path, Sarah replied, her tone carrying a warning. One that doesn't involve either of those things. No, it doesn't, Emma agreed, straightening up from her work. I'm going to MIT next year. Computer science and community development, going to build systems that help people connect and protect each other, like our town app did. Deadeye nodded slowly. Like father? Like daughter? He must be proud. He died in Fallujah, Sarah said quietly. Never knew he had a daughter. But he believed in building things, not destroying them. That's his legacy. The silence that followed was interrupted by the arrival of Carmen Torres, her arms still in a cast, but her head held high. Deadeye stiffened, but she ignored him, walking straight to Sarah. The insurance company finally got back to me about the garage, she announced. They're denying the claim, said there's no proof it wasn't just random vandalism. Sarah put down her wrench, wiping her hands clean. How bad? Bad enough to shut us down permanently. Dad's life work, everything he built. Carmen's voice cracked slightly. Unless, Deadeye spoke up suddenly, someone with experience in insurance investigations provided evidence that it was a coordinated criminal act. Documentation, witness statements, patterns of similar incidents across state lines. Everyone turned to look at him. He stood, pulling out his phone. Before I was Master Sergeant Thompson, before I was Deadeye, I worked insurance fraud cases, still know some people who owe me favors. Why would you help? Carmen demanded. Your men did this. Because I forgot something important. Deadeye replied, something I learned in Kandahar, but tried to bury under years of anger and power games. Sometimes the strongest position isn't the most aggressive one. He looked at Sarah. You could have killed me a dozen times in that market. Could have let that bus become collateral damage and maintained your cover. Could have destroyed our bikes and our reputation permanently. Instead, you chose the harder path each time, the path that left room for change. Sarah studied him carefully. And now? Now I'm thinking about legacy, about building instead of destroying. He turned to Carmen. Let me make this right. Not just the insurance, but the repairs. I've got men with construction experience, men looking for honest work, but caught up in this life because they thought they had no choice. Like you were? Emma asked boldly. Deadeye managed a small smile. Smart kid. Yes, like I was. After Kandahar, after losing my career, I thought power was the only way to matter again. Didn't realize I was becoming everything I used to fight against. Sarah picked up her wrench again, returning to work on the bike. Talk is cheap, David. Actions matter. I know, he acknowledged. That's why I've already sent documentation about our operations in other states to the FBI. Turned state's evidence this morning. The Hollow Men are finished. But the men themselves? They could be something different, something better. Carmen looked skeptical. You expect us to trust you? Just like that? No, Deadeye replied. I expect you to verify everything I say. Keep watching. Keep those cameras rolling. Trust is earned and we've got a lot to make up for. He paused, then added, but maybe start by letting us help rebuild your garage. Under supervision, with proper contracts and documentation. Let us prove we can create instead of destroy. Sarah stepped back from the now repaired bike, surveying her work. You understand this isn't just about Carmen's garage. The youth center needs repairs. Mrs. Henderson's fence still isn't fixed. And those kids you tried to extort, they need their money back, with interest, and college scholarships, Emma added firmly, for the ones graduating this year. Deadeye nodded slowly. College scholarships, community service, legitimate jobs program for my men who want to change, whatever it takes to make this right. He looked around the shop, at the tools and machines that could either break or fix, hurt or heal. You know what I realized? Watching you work these past 3 days, we're not so different from these bikes. Sometimes what looks broken just needs someone skilled enough to see the potential for repair. Sarah wiped her hands clean one final time. All right then, let's start with the garage. But understand something. One wrong move, one step back, toward your old ways, and you'll learn exactly how good a shot I still am. Clear? Crystal, Deadeye replied. After all, I've seen your work up close. In Kandahar and here. He extended his hand. No more Deadeye, just David Thompson trying to fix what he broke. The transformation of Cedar Grove began at Carmen's garage. Under the watchful eyes of community members and security cameras, former Hollow Men traded their leather cuts for work clothes. David Thompson, no longer using his road name, supervised the reconstruction personally, showing a knowledge of building codes and safety regulations that surprised everyone. Snake Tattoo, whose real name turned out to be Michael Reynolds, revealed himself to be a skilled electrician before his life took a wrong turn. He worked alongside the town's licensed contractors, rewiring the garage with meticulous care. Each evening, he would spend extra hours teaching interested local kids about electrical systems, his face lighting up when they grasped complex concepts. Never thought I'd be proud of honest work again, he told Sarah one evening as she inspected the progress. Spent so long thinking respect came from fear. Sarah watched him label every wire, triple-checking his connections. Fear's easy. Building trust? That takes real skill. The youth center became their next project. The same men who had terrorized children now found themselves building basketball courts and installing security systems to protect them. The transformation wasn't always smooth. Old habits died hard, and trust came slowly. But day by day, moment by moment, changes took root. Emma's coding club started meeting at Wright's Auto Repair, where they developed a job training app to help former gang members find legitimate work. She worked side by side with Isabel, Carmen's daughter, turning their trauma into a tool for positive change. "Mom," Emma called out one afternoon, her laptop displaying complex programming code. "You need to see this. Remember how some of the Hollow Men said they couldn't find work because of their records? Sarah wiped grease from her hands, moving to look at the screen. The app showed a network of businesses across 3 states, all willing to give second chances to reformed gang members. Many were owned by veterans or had connections to rehabilitation programs. David helped us connect with them, Isabel explained. Turns out, a lot of people want to help if you give them a chance to do it safely. David Thompson, working nearby on a transmission, nodded without looking up. Found out something interesting too. Some of these businesses, they're owned by families of people we used to intimidate. They're willing to help, not because they've forgotten, but because they believe in redemption. Sarah watched him work, noting how his hands moved with the same precision she'd seen in Kandahar, but now turned to creation instead of destruction. Redemption's earned one day at a time, she said quietly. Like trust, he agreed. Like respect. The afternoon light filtered through the garage windows, catching on the tools and machines that had become symbols of transformation. In one corner, Mrs. Henderson was teaching 2 former Hollow Men the basics of competitive shooting, her patience unlimited as they learned to control their breathing and steady their hands. Different kind of shooting than we're used to. One of them commented, carefully adjusting his stance. Better kind, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. This one's about discipline and control, not power over others. Annie Blackwood had set up a small photography studio in the garage's office, teaching interested gang members about camera work and digital editing. Every story needs documenting, she explained, showing them how to capture not just images, but moments of change. Your transformation could inspire others. The most surprising change came from Switchblade. The man who had once taken pride in causing fear now spent his evenings at the community college, working toward a counseling degree. Saw too many kids heading down the same road I did, he explained during a break from studying. Figure maybe I can help them find a better path. Sarah found herself working later each evening, her shop becoming more than just a garage. It was a classroom, a community center, a place where second chances took physical form in repaired machines and rebuilt lives. One night, as she was closing up, she found David staring at the wall of photographs Annie had been collecting. Images of former Hollow Men working alongside community members, teaching skills, learning new trades. Keep thinking about that day in Kandahar, he said without turning around, about choices and consequences. You know what really got to me? Not just that you could have taken the shot, but that you chose not to. Chose to give me a chance to be better, even back then. Sarah stood beside him, looking at the photos. Sometimes the hardest targets aren't the ones you're aiming at. Sometimes they're the walls we build around ourselves. David nodded slowly. Fear, pride, anger, they're comfortable weapons, familiar, giving them up. That's scarier than any firefight. But worth it, Emma added, joining them with her laptop. She pulled up the job training app, showing its latest statistics. Look, 37 former Hollow Men employed, 15 enrolled in education programs, 0 arrests or backslides. Numbers don't lie, Sarah agreed, remembering her own transition from warrior to mechanic. But they don't tell the whole story either. The real victory is in the small moments. A kid learning to trust again, a man finding pride in honest work, a community healing together. Through the open garage door, they could see Carmen's restored garage glowing in the evening light, its new sign promising quality work, second chances. Next door, the youth center echoed with the sound of basketball and laughter. No longer a place of fear, but of growth. 6 months after the confrontation that changed Cedar Grove, the town hosted its first Community Transformation Fair. The event, organized by Emma and Isabel, took over the main street, showcasing the remarkable changes that had swept through their community. walked through their Wright's Auto Repair had expanded, adding a vocational training center where former Hollow Men taught automotive skills alongside Sarah. The sight of Snake Tattoo, now known simply as Mike, patiently explaining engine diagnostics to a group of attentive high school students had become wonderfully ordinary. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Martinez commented, watching the demonstrations from her position near the refreshment stand. "Former outlaws teaching kids about spark plugs instead of hot wiring," Sarah smiled, wiping grease from her hands as she joined Kate at the stand. "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who learned their lessons the hard way." The fair sprawled across town, each booth telling part of Cedar Grove's transformation story. Carmen's garage had become a symbol of resurrection, its walls now adorned with before and after photos documenting its destruction and rebuild. But more impressive than the physical restoration was the mentorship program she ran with David Thompson, teaching business skills to former gang members. "Just signed our 10th graduate," Carmen announced proudly, her once broken arm now strong enough to demonstrate brake repairs. 3 of them already starting their own shops in neighboring towns, legitimate businesses, all of them. At the youth center booth, Switchblade, now answering to Tom, displayed artwork created by at-risk teens he counseled. The pieces told stories of change, hope, and second chances, many inspired by the town's recent history. "This one's special," he said, pointing to a painting of a motorcycle being transformed into a dove. "Kid who made it? His older brother was in a gang. Now they both volunteer here, teaching art to younger kids." Emma's coding club had set up an interactive display showcasing their expanded community app. What had started as a simple alert system had evolved into a comprehensive platform for community organization and rehabilitation support. "We're getting inquiries from towns across the state," Emma explained to a group of visiting officials. "They want to know how we did it, how we turned a potential gang war into a restoration movement." Isabel, manning the computer station beside her, pulled up their latest statistics. "It's not just about the numbers, though they're impressive. It's about the stories behind them, like how our app helped match former gang members' skills with community needs, or how it coordinates volunteer projects that bring former enemies together." Sarah watched her daughter with pride, remembering the scared teenager who'd once hidden in the shop's back room. Now, Emma stood confident, articulate, already accepted to MIT with a full scholarship funded partly by the rehabilitation programs. Success. The most powerful display stood in the center of the fair, a wall of photographs taken by Annie Blackwood. They told Cedar Grove's story in stark, honest images: the confrontation at Wright's Auto Repair, the destruction of Carmen's garage, the rebuilding process, and the countless small moments of transformation that followed. "That's my favorite," David said quietly, joining Sarah as she studied a particular photo. It showed him teaching a group of former Hollow Men proper construction techniques, his face intent as he demonstrated measuring techniques. "Reminds me that precision and attention to detail can build things up instead of just taking them down." Sarah nodded, understanding the parallel to their shared military past. "Different kind of mission planning." "Better kind," he agreed. "Yesterday, got a call from a gang leader in Riverside. Word spreading about what we did here. He wanted to know if our program could work in his territory." "What did you tell him?" "Told him transformation's not easy. Takes more courage than violence ever did. But if he's serious..." David gestured at the fair around them. "We've created a blueprint, not just for rehabilitation, but for real change." The fair had drawn visitors from across the state, law enforcement officials studying their rehabilitation model, business owners interested in their second chance employment program, and former gang members seeking their own path to redemption. Mrs. Henderson's shooting club demonstration drew particular attention. The sight of the elderly woman teaching reformed outlaws Olympic-style target shooting somehow encapsulated Cedar Grove's transformation perfectly. "Proper breathing," she instructed, adjusting a former biker's stance. Just like in life, control, patience, and knowing exactly what you're aiming for. As evening approached, the fair took on a festival atmosphere. The youth center's basketball team, now coached by former Hollow Men, played an exhibition game against the sheriff's department. Local businesses served food, their stands staffed by unlikely partnerships of long-time residents and reformed gang members. Annie moved through the crowd, her camera capturing it all. "You know what the best part is?" she asked Sarah, showing her some shots. "Nobody's posing. Nobody's trying to prove anything. This is just who we are now." Sarah watched as Mike helped a young girl repair her bicycle at the free maintenance station they'd set up. Nearby, Tom counseled a teenage boy wearing a leather jacket too big for him, their conversation intense but hopeful. Carmen and Isabel demonstrated basic car maintenance to a group of women, while David consulted with visiting officials about expanding their program. "We're not just fixing machines anymore," Sarah observed. "We're helping people rebuild themselves." 1 year after the transformation of Cedar Grove began, Sarah stood in her expanded shop, watching the sunrise through windows that now overlooked not just a garage, but a community rehabilitation center. The morning ritual of checking diagnostic equipment and preparing workstations now included setting up classrooms and counseling spaces. "Morning, Mom," Emma called out, rushing through the shop with her laptop bag slung over one shoulder. "Don't forget we've got the state review board coming today." Sarah nodded, already dressed in her crisp new uniform. Not military fatigues or even standard mechanics coveralls, but a professional outfit bearing the logo of the Cedar Grove Second Chance Initiative. The program had grown far beyond their initial expectations, becoming a model for community transformation across the state. David Thompson arrived early, as he always did now, carrying a stack of reports and certification papers. His leather cut had long since been replaced by business casual attire, though he still rode his motorcycle to work every day. "Latest numbers are in," he announced, spreading the documents on Sarah's office desk. 87% success rate across all 4 satellite programs. State Department of Corrections wants to make us their official rehabilitation partner. Sarah reviewed the papers, noting how their small-town experiment had evolved into something none of them had imagined. The garage still operated as an auto repair shop, but it had become so much more: a training center, a counseling facility, a place where former outlaws learned not just mechanical skills, but how to rebuild their lives. Mike Reynolds, formerly Snake Tattoo, burst into the office, his face lit with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he exclaimed, waving his phone. "Remember that kid from the youth center, Joey? The one whose brother was in the River Kings gang? He just got accepted to trade school, full scholarship from our foundation." The foundation had been Emma's idea, using profits from their successful rehabilitation programs to fund education for at-risk youth and reformed gang members. It was one of many initiatives that had sprouted from their original confrontation. Carmen arrived next, bringing coffee for everyone, a morning tradition that had replaced the tension-filled standoffs of a year ago. "Got 3 new applications for the apprenticeship program," she reported. 2 from former Hollow Men chapters in other states, 1 from a kid whose father I used to work on bikes with before. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all remembered the violence that had preceded their transformation. But now, Carmen's garage stood as a testament to change, its walls covered with certification certificates earned by former gang members who'd found a better path. "Tom's already interviewing them," she continued, referring to the former Switchblade who had become their lead counselor. "Says they show real promise." The morning's peace was interrupted by the rumble of motorcycles, but no one tensed up anymore. Instead, Sarah watched through her office window as a group of leather-clad riders parked in the designated spaces, former Hollow Men arriving for their shift as instructors and mentors. Still feels strange sometimes, David mused, standing beside her, watching them pull up and knowing they're here to build instead of destroy. Sarah understood. She still occasionally caught herself scanning rooftops and checking sightlines, old habits from her sniper days mixing with newer, more hopeful routines. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the parking lot as she arrived for her morning shooting class. The Olympic-style target shooting program she ran had become an unexpected cornerstone of their rehabilitation efforts, teaching discipline, focus, and controlled breathing to people who once used violence as their only tool. "Today's the day, isn't it?" the elderly woman asked as she entered the office. "The State Review Board. This afternoon," Emma confirmed, looking up from her laptop where she was finalizing the presentation. "They're evaluating us for official statewide implementation of our program model." Sarah watched as more people arrived. Annie with her camera to document another day of transformation, Sheriff Martinez dropping by to share intelligence about the gangs showing interest in their program, Isabel setting up the computer lab where she taught coding skills to former outlaws. "Remember when this was just an auto repair shop?" Carmen asked, joining them at the window. "Now look at it. We're practically running a small college." "More than that," Sarah replied. "We're running proof that people can change when given the right tools and support." The morning continued with its new normal. Former gang members teaching automotive skills alongside professional mechanics. Counseling sessions happening in converted offices. Shooting lessons focused on Olympic targets instead of rival gangs. Coding classes, teaching digital skills to people who once lived by violence. Emma's community app had evolved into a comprehensive support system, coordinating everything from job placements to emergency response. She'd already received inquiries from tech companies interested in implementing it in other cities. "You know what I realized," David said, as they prepared for the State Review Board's arrival. "A year ago, when you confronted us in this very garage, you weren't just stopping us from hurting the town. You were showing us a different way to be strong." Sarah thought about that day, about the choices that had led them here. "Strength isn't always about who can do the most damage," she said, watching a former Hollow Man patiently teach a teenage girl how to diagnose engine problems. "Sometimes it's about who can help others rebuild." The State Review Board would arrive that afternoon to evaluate their program. But the real proof of its success was already visible in every corner of Cedar Grove, in the restored businesses, the thriving youth center, the transformed lives. They had turned a potential tragedy into a model for change, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal when a community chose to build bridges instead of walls. 5 years after Sarah Wright first stood down the hollow men in her garage, Cedar Grove had become a beacon of hope for communities across the country. The small auto repair shop that started it all had evolved into the headquarters of a national rehabilitation network. Its success story featured in documentary films and studied by social scientists. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood at a podium in front of Wright's Auto Repair, now expanded into a sprawling campus that included vocational training facilities, counseling centers, and administrative offices. Around her gathered an unlikely audience: reformed gang members, state officials, community leaders, and most importantly, the graduating class of their latest rehabilitation program. "When I first moved to Cedar Grove," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "I thought I was leaving behind one kind of battlefield for a simpler life. Instead, I found a different kind of war. Not between nations or armies, but between hope and fear, between the past we're given and the future we choose." In the front row, Emma sat beside David Thompson, both now directors of the Cedar Grove Initiative. Emma had returned from MIT with degrees in computer science and social development, turning their local community app into a nationwide platform for rehabilitation programs. David, his former dead-eye persona long forgotten, had become one of the country's leading experts in gang intervention and community transformation. "Look around you," Sarah continued, gesturing to the transformed campus. "Every building here tells a story of change. That garage isn't just where we fix engines, it's where we learned that broken things can be rebuilt. The shooting range, where Mrs. Henderson still teaches, isn't about power over others. It's about mastery of ourselves. The youth center isn't just a place for kids to play, it's where we break cycles of violence before they begin." Mike Reynolds, his snake tattoo now incorporated into the initiative's logo of transformation, stood with his first class of certified electricians. They wore uniforms bearing the words, "Powered by Change," a program he'd developed to help former gang members enter the electrical trade. Carmen Torres, who had expanded her garage into a regional training center, sat with Isabel, who now ran their technology education department. Together, they had created a network of women-owned automotive businesses that specifically hired graduates of their program. "But the real story isn't in these buildings," Sarah said, her voice softening. "It's in the choices each of you made. The day you decided that redemption was worth more than reputation. The moment you realized that true strength lies not in causing fear, but in creating hope." Tom, the former switchblade, now held a master's degree in counseling and supervised their mental health services. His innovative trauma recovery program had become a model for rehabilitation centers nationwide. He nodded as Sarah spoke, remembering his own journey from enforcer to healer. "5 years ago, we stood in this very spot as enemies," Sarah continued, looking at the graduates. "Today we stand as proof that transformation isn't just possible, it's contagious. Each of you sitting here has inspired others to follow your path. Your stories have reached people we never thought we could touch." She was right. Their success had sparked similar initiatives across the country. Former gang members who completed their program had gone on to start rehabilitation centers in their own communities. The Cedar Grove model had been adopted by cities and towns facing similar challenges, each adding their own unique elements while maintaining the core principles of community involvement and second chances. "But our work isn't finished," Sarah declared, her voice strengthening. "Every day we hear from more communities needing help, more people seeking change. That's why today isn't just a graduation, it's a beginning. Each of you is leaving here with more than just certificates and job skills. You're leaving with a mission." In the audience, Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, remembering the day she'd marched up to armed bikers with nothing but righteous indignation and a cell phone. Now she trained Olympic-level shooting competitors, many of them former gang members who had found discipline and purpose through her program. Sheriff Martinez, still serving Cedar Grove, but now also consulting for police departments nationwide, smiled as she recalled her initial skepticism about rehabilitating the hollow men. The program had reduced crime rates so dramatically that her deputies spent more time helping with community projects than making arrests. "Some people still ask me why I didn't just run the hollow men out of town when I had the chance," Sarah continued, her voice carrying notes of both strength and compassion. "They don't understand that pushing problems away never solves them. Real change happens when we face our challenges head-on, when we see the potential for good in places others might miss." Annie Blackwood's cameras captured it all, adding to her extensive documentation of Cedar Grove's transformation. Her photographs, showing the before and after of their community's journey, had become powerful tools for other towns considering similar programs. "So today, as you graduate," Sarah concluded, "remember this. You're not just leaving behind your past, you're becoming architects of the future. Every engine you repair, every building you wire, every youth you counsel, every line of code you write becomes part of something bigger. You're not just changing your own lives, you're showing others that change is possible." As she finished speaking, the graduates rose as one, their faces reflecting pride and purpose. They were no longer defined by their past mistakes, but by their present choices and future potential. The crowd erupted in applause, celebrating not just individual achievements, but the triumph of an idea, that even the deepest wounds could heal, that the hardest hearts could soften, and that sometimes the best shot is the one you never have to take. After the graduation ceremony, Sarah found herself back in her original garage bay, the place where everything had started. The space had been preserved almost exactly as it was 5 years ago, though now it served as both a working repair shop and a living history exhibit of their journey. Emma found her there, standing by the workbench where she'd first confronted Deadeye Thompson and his crew. "Someone wants to meet you, Mom," she said softly. A young woman stepped into the garage, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a leather jacket that seemed too big for her frame. Sarah recognized the patches. They belonged to a gang from 3 states over, one they'd been trying to reach for months. "My name's Rachel," the young woman said, her voice carrying equal measures of defiance and hope. "My brother completed your program last year. He told me about the mechanic who could see past who people were to who they could become." Sarah gestured to a nearby stool, the same one where David had sat during their first real conversation about change. "Tell me your story, Rachel." As Rachel talked, others began filtering into the garage. David, Carmen, Mike, Tom, and the rest of the core team that had built this miracle together. They listened as Rachel described her gang's territory, the escalating violence, the feeling of being trapped in a cycle they couldn't break. "We heard about Cedar Grove," Rachel explained, "about how a town stood up to violence, not with more violence, but with something else, something stronger." She pulled out her phone, showing them a saved article about their program. "Is it true? Can people really change that much?" Sarah looked around the garage, at the faces of those who had once been her enemies and were now her closest allies. "See that oil stain on the floor?" she pointed. "That's from the first bike I taught Mike to repair properly. He was still wearing his Hollow Men cut, still had more anger than hope. Now he runs our electrical certification program." Mike nodded, unconsciously touching the snake tattoo that had become a symbol of transformation. "Hardest part wasn't learning the skills," he admitted. "It was learning to trust that we deserved another chance." Rachel's eyes moved to the tool chest, where Sarah had once grabbed a wrench to make a point to Deadeye. Now it was decorated with photos of graduates working on engines, each one a story of redemption. "Your brother," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Which class was he in?" "Spring session last year," Rachel replied. "Marcus Rodriguez. He's running a youth outreach program back home now, trying to stop kids from making the same mistakes he did." David straightened up at the name. "I remember Marcus. He asked the tough questions, challenged everything. Now he's one of our strongest advocates in the Southwest region." Emma, who had been quietly working on her laptop, spoke up. "Marcus's program has already diverted 37 kids from gang recruitment in the past 6 months. Our app shows a 40% reduction in youth violence in his area." Rachel's tough exterior cracked slightly. "That's why I'm here. Marcus said you might be willing to help us set up something similar. Our whole territory's at a breaking point. Everyone's tired of the violence, but nobody knows how to stop it." Sarah picked up a wrench, feeling its familiar weight. "You know what I learned as a sniper? The hardest part isn't taking the shot. It's knowing when not to. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lower your weapon and offer your hand instead." She set the wrench down and faced Rachel directly. "Your territory doesn't need more violence. It needs what Cedar Grove found, a community willing to stand together, to see people as they could be, not just as they are." "But how?" Rachel asked, her voice smaller now. "We don't have anything like this." "You have your brother," Carmen pointed out. "You have hope. That's how we started." Tom, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. 5 years ago, I was pointing weapons at kids outside a youth center. Now I counsel those same kids, help them find better paths. Change isn't easy, but it's possible. Always possible, Sarah moved to her office, returning with a thick binder labeled Cedar Grove Model Community Transformation Guide. This is everything we learned, everything we built, but more importantly, she pulled out her phone, sending a quick message. I'm connecting you with our advanced team. They help communities start their own programs, adapt our model to local needs. Just like that, Rachel asked, surprised by the immediate offer of help. Just like that, Sarah confirmed. Because 5 years ago, someone gave us a chance to be better than we were. Now we do the same for others. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting long shadows that reminded Sarah of that first confrontation. But now, instead of tension and fear, the garage held hope and possibility. You know what the real secret is? She told Rachel, gesturing to everyone gathered in the garage. It's not about erasing the past. It's about building a future strong enough to overcome it. Every person in this room was once someone else's problem, someone else's threat. Now look at us. Mechanics, teachers, counselors, community leaders. Emma stepped forward, pulling up the community app on a large screen. See these dots? Each one represents a graduate of our program who's now helping others. 5 years ago, there was just one dot. Cedar Grove. Now there are hundreds, spreading across the country, each one a story of change, of hope. Rachel looked at the map, at the network of light spreading across the darkness. Like stars, she whispered. Like stars, Sarah agreed, and there's always room for one more. As the sun set over Cedar Grove, the garage that had once been a battleground continued its work of transformation. Rachel stayed late into the evening, learning about their program, making plans for her territory's future, and Sarah Wright, the mechanic who had once been a sniper, who had chosen to build rather than destroy, watched another cycle of change begin. In the end, it hadn't taken a perfect shot to save Cedar Grove. It had taken something far more powerful, the courage to see beyond the surface, the strength to offer second chances, and the wisdom to know that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from turning them into allies. 10 years had passed since Sarah Wright first stared down the hollow men in her garage, and Cedar Grove had become more than just a success story. It was a legend in the world of community transformation. On the 10th anniversary of that fateful confrontation, journalists, community leaders, and graduates of their program gathered from across the country to celebrate what had become known as the Cedar Grove Miracle. The original Wright's Auto repair shop, now a National Historic Site, had been preserved exactly as it was on that crucial day, right down to the tools on the workbench. But around it, an entire campus of hope had grown. The Cedar Grove Institute for Community Transformation sprawled across 20 acres, including vocational training facilities, counseling centers, residential programs, and the most advanced rehabilitation research center in the country. Sarah, her hair now streaked with gray but her presence still commanding, walked through the museum that had once been her office. Display cases held artifacts of their journey. The wrench she'd used to make her point to Deadeye, Mrs. Henderson's famous wooden spoon, the first leather cuts surrendered by reformed hollow men. Each item told part of their story, but the real treasures were the lives transformed. Emma, now Dr. Emma Wright, led the Institute's technology division. Her community app had evolved into a comprehensive digital platform used by rehabilitation programs worldwide. She'd married Isabel Torres, and together they'd created programming boot camps specifically designed for former gang members, turning street smarts into coding skills. "Mom," Emma called out, finding Sarah in the museum. "The documentary crew is ready for your interview. They want to film it in the original garage bay." Sarah nodded, following her daughter to the preserved workspace that had started it all. The documentary, produced by a major streaming service, would tell Cedar Grove's story to its largest audience yet. But before the cameras rolled, a commotion at the entrance caught their attention. A group of motorcycles had pulled up, not hollow men this time, but graduates of their program from across the country. Leading them was David Thompson, his face weathered but peaceful, returning from another successful intervention mission. Had to make it back for the anniversary, he said, embracing Sarah. You won't believe what we accomplished in Detroit. Entire neighborhoods transforming, just like Cedar Grove. The Detroit project had been their most ambitious yet. A coalition of former gang members trained in Cedar Grove had returned to their old territories not as conquerors, but as healers. They'd used the Cedar Grove model to turn abandoned auto plants into training centers, converting symbols of urban decay into beacons of hope. Mike Reynolds, his snake tattoo now accompanied by a master electrician's license, joined them with news from the vocational program. Just placed our 10,000th graduate, he announced proudly. Full-time job, benefits, career path, everything we dreamed of offering when we started. The documentary crew captured it all. The reunions, the stories, the living proof that transformation wasn't just possible, but sustainable. They filmed Sarah walking through the original garage, explaining how each space had played a role in their journey. This spot, she said, indicating a particular section of floor, is where I first saw the possibility of change in dead eyes. Not surrender, not defeat, but the first spark of understanding that there might be a different way to be strong. The cameras followed her to the modern training facilities where former gang members from across the country learned everything, from auto repair to computer programming. In one classroom, Tom, the former switchblade, taught conflict resolution techniques he'd developed, combining his street experience with professional counseling training. The key, he explained to his students, is understanding that strength doesn't come from making others fear you. It comes from helping them find their own strength. Carmen Torres, now a nationally recognized expert in community-based business development, had expanded her garage into a franchise of social enterprise auto shops. Each location was staffed entirely by program graduates, proving that second chances could be both socially responsible and profitable. We're not just fixing cars, she told the documentary crew. We're fixing the way society views rehabilitation. Every successful business we launch shows that transformation isn't just moral, it's economically smart. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Rachel Rodriguez, the young woman who'd sought their help 5 years ago. She'd gone on to establish similar programs across the Southwest, creating a network of rehabilitation centers that had transformed some of the country's most troubled territories. Remember that leather jacket I was wearing when we first met? She asked Sarah. The one that was too big for me. We display it in our museum now, right next to the first set of graduation certificates from our program. Sarah smiled, remembering that crucial conversation in the garage. How many graduates so far? 3,000 direct program completions, Rachel reported proudly. But the indirect impact, we estimate over 50,000 lives touched when you count family members, community effects and prevention programs. The documentary team captured a roundtable discussion where the original team, Sarah, David, Emma, Carmen, Mike and Tom, reflected on how their model had evolved over the decade. The biggest lesson, David observed, wasn't about rehabilitation techniques or program structures. It was about seeing people's potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Emma added, and about using technology not just to monitor or control, but to connect and empower. Our app doesn't just track progress, it builds communities. As evening approached, Sarah found herself back in the original garage bay, alone except for the documentary's interviewer. The cameras rolled as she shared her final thoughts on their journey. "You know, I used to think my military training was about learning to take the perfect shot," she reflected. "But what Cedar Grove taught me was that the most important skill I learned as a sniper wasn't about hitting targets. It was about patience, about seeing the bigger picture, about understanding that every action has consequences beyond the immediate impact." She ran her hand along the workbench, feeling the familiar dents and scratches that told their story. This garage became a metaphor for what we do. In auto repair, you don't just fix the immediate problem. You look for root causes, you prevent future breakdowns, you maintain and improve. That's exactly what we do with people's lives. The documentary concluded with a powerful sequence. Aerial shots of Cedar Grove showing how the Institute had grown, interviews with graduates who'd become community leaders, statistics demonstrating the program's success, and finally, a return to the simple garage where it all began. But the real story continued beyond the cameras. That evening, after the film crew had packed up, the core team gathered in the original garage bay for their own private celebration. They were joined by Mrs. Henderson, still teaching marksmanship at 93, and Sheriff Martinez, whose community policing model had been adopted by departments nationwide. 10 years, Sarah mused, looking around at the faces of people who had become family. 10 years since we chose to build instead of destroy. 10 years of proving that the hardest hearts can soften, David added, that the deepest wounds can heal. Emma pulled up the latest data on her tablet. "Look at this. We've created a ripple effect. Every successful graduate becomes a catalyst for change in their own community. The transformation is exponential now." As they shared memories and plans for the future, a new group of program participants watched from the doorway, seeing living proof that change was possible. Among them was a young woman who reminded Sarah of herself at that age. Tough, scarred by life, but carrying a spark of hope. The next morning, Sarah would return to work, continuing the mission that had grown far beyond anything she'd imagined. There would be new challenges, new territories to heal, new lives to transform. But for now, she stood in her garage surrounded by former enemies turned family, celebrating not just what they'd accomplished, but what they'd become. The legacy of Cedar Grove wasn't just in the buildings they'd constructed or the programs they'd developed. It was in the thousands of lives transformed, the communities healed, the cycles of violence broken. It was proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a threat, but the courage to see the good in people and the patience to help them find it in themselves. And it all started with a mechanic who chose to take a different kind of shot, not one that ended lives, but one that transformed them. 10 years had passed since Sarah Wright first stared down the hollow men in her garage, and Cedar Grove had become more than just a success story. It was a legend in the world of community transformation. On the 10th anniversary of that fateful confrontation, journalists, community leaders, and graduates of their program gathered from across the country to celebrate what had become known as the Cedar Grove Miracle. The original Wright's Auto repair shop, now a National Historic Site, had been preserved exactly as it was on that crucial day, right down to the tools on the workbench. But around it, an entire campus of hope had grown. The Cedar Grove Institute for Community Transformation sprawled across 20 acres, including vocational training facilities, counseling centers, residential programs, and the most advanced rehabilitation research center in the country. Sarah, her hair now streaked with gray, but her presence still commanding, walked through the museum that had once been her office. Display cases held artifacts of their journey, the wrench she'd used to make her point to Deadeye, Mrs. Henderson's famous wooden spoon, the first leather cuts surrendered by reformed hollow men. Each item told part of their story, but the real treasures were the lives transformed. Emma, now Dr. Emma Wright, led the Institute's technology division. Her community app had evolved into a comprehensive digital platform used by rehabilitation programs worldwide. She'd married Isabel Torres, and together they'd created programming boot camps specifically designed for former gang members, turning street smarts into coding skills. "Mom," Emma called out, finding Sarah in the museum, "the documentary crew is ready for your interview. They want to film it in the original garage bay." Sarah nodded, following her daughter to the preserved workspace that had started it all. The documentary, produced by a major streaming service, would tell Cedar Grove's story to its largest audience yet. But before the cameras rolled, a commotion at the entrance caught their attention. A group of motorcycles had pulled up. Not hollow men this time, but graduates of their program from across the country. Leading them was David Thompson, his face weathered but peaceful, returning from another successful intervention mission. "Had to make it back for the anniversary," he said, embracing Sarah. "You won't believe what we accomplished in Detroit. Entire neighborhoods transforming, just like Cedar Grove." The Detroit project had been their most ambitious yet. A coalition of former gang members trained in Cedar Grove had returned to their old territories, not as conquerors, but as healers. They'd used the Cedar Grove model to turn abandoned auto plants into training centers, converting symbols of urban decay into beacons of hope. Mike Reynolds, his snake tattoo now accompanied by a master electrician's license, joined them with news from the vocational program. "Just placed our 10,000th graduate," he announced proudly. "Full-time job, benefits, career path, everything we dreamed of offering when we started." The documentary crew captured it all: the reunions, the stories, the living proof that transformation wasn't just possible, but sustainable. They filmed Sarah walking through the original garage, explaining how each space had played a role in their journey. "This spot," she said, indicating a particular section of floor, "is where I first saw the possibility of change in dead eyes. Eyes. Not surrender, not defeat, but the first spark of understanding that there might be a different way to be strong." The cameras followed her to the modern training facilities, where former gang members from across the country learned everything from auto repair to computer programming. In one classroom, Tom, the former switchblade, taught conflict resolution, techniques he'd developed, combining his street experience with professional counseling training. "The key," he explained to his students, "is understanding that strength doesn't come from making others fear you. It comes from helping them find their own strength." Carmen Torres, now a nationally recognized expert in community-based business development, had expanded her garage into a franchise of social enterprise auto shops. Each location was staffed entirely by program graduates, proving that second chances could be both socially responsible and profitable. "We're not just fixing cars," she told the documentary crew. "We're fixing the way society views rehabilitation. Every successful business we launch shows that transformation isn't just moral, it's economically smart." The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Rachel Rodriguez, the young woman who'd sought their help 5 years ago. She'd gone on to establish similar programs across the Southwest, creating a network of rehabilitation centers that had transformed some of the country's most troubled territories. "Remember that leather jacket I was wearing when we first met?" she asked Sarah. "The one that was too big for me? We display it in our museum now, right next to the first set of graduation certificates from our program." Sarah smiled, remembering that crucial conversation in the garage. "How many graduates so far?" 3,000 direct program completions, Rachel reported proudly. "But the indirect impact? We estimate over 50,000 lives touched when you count family members, community effects, and prevention programs." The documentary team captured a roundtable discussion where the original team, Sarah, David, Emma, Carmen, Mike, and Tom, reflected on how their model had evolved over the decade. "The biggest lesson," David observed, "wasn't about rehabilitation techniques or program structures. It was about seeing people's potential, even when they couldn't see it themselves." Emma added, and about using technology not just to monitor or control, but to connect and empower. Our app doesn't just track progress, it builds communities. As evening approached, Sarah found herself back in the original garage bay, alone, except for the documentary's interviewer. The cameras rolled as she shared her final thoughts on their journey. You know, I used to think my military training was about learning to take the perfect shot, she reflected. But what Cedar Grove taught me was that the most important skill I learned as a sniper wasn't about hitting targets. It was about patience, about seeing the bigger picture, about understanding that every action has consequences beyond the immediate impact. She ran her hand along the workbench, feeling the familiar dents and scratches that told their story. This garage became a metaphor for what we do. In auto repair, you don't just fix the immediate problem. You look for root causes. You prevent future breakdowns. You maintain and improve. That's exactly what we do with people's lives. The documentary concluded with a powerful sequence, aerial shots of Cedar Grove showing how the Institute had grown, interviews with graduates who'd become community leaders, statistics demonstrating the program's success, and finally, a return to the simple garage where it all began. But the real story continued beyond the cameras. That evening, after the film crew had packed up, the core team gathered in the original garage bay for their own private celebration. They were joined by Mrs. Henderson, still teaching marksmanship at 93, and Sheriff Martinez, whose community policing model had been adopted by departments nationwide. 10 years, Sarah mused, looking around at the faces of people who had become family. 10 years since we chose to build instead of destroy. 10 years of proving that the hardest hearts can soften, David added, that the deepest wounds can heal. Emma pulled up the latest data on her tablet. Look at this. We've created a ripple effect. Every successful graduate becomes a catalyst for change in their own community. The transformation is exponential now. As they shared memories and plans for the future, a new group of program participants watched from the doorway, seeing living proof that change was possible. Among them was a young woman who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, tough, scarred by life, but carrying a spark of hope. The next morning, Sarah would return to work, continuing the mission that had grown far beyond anything she'd imagined. There would be new challenges, new territories to heal, new lives to transform. But for now, she stood in her garage, surrounded by former enemies turned family, celebrating not just what they'd accomplished, but what they'd become. The legacy of Cedar Grove wasn't just in the buildings they'd constructed or the programs they'd developed. It was in the thousands of lives transformed, the communities healed, the cycles of violence broken. It was proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a threat, but the courage to see the good in people and the patience to help them find it in themselves. And it all started with a mechanic who chose to take a different kind of shot, not one that ended lives, but one that transformed them.